Movement at the shoulder is deceptively simple. It looks like we're doing one simple movement, but really we're getting movement at 4 different joints. The sternoclavicular, acromioclavicular, glenohumeral, and scapulothoracic joints. There's a lot going on. Because of this, the shoulder is the most mobile joint in the body, but also one of the most complex to rehabilitate and figure out how to move properly. What I hope to do in this video is explain the specifics of how the shoulder moves, and hopefully you can apply that to your own rehab or training. To start with, I'll look at how things could potentially go wrong developmentally. So when we're younger, we have a retroverted humerus. Big word, just means that it is twisted towards the back. What happens is as we age, it starts to come back internally. However, if you have excess torsion, so some sort of torque force acting on the shoulder as a kid, it can affect the growth plate and affect how turned out your shoulders are. And in fact, a lot of like throwers, for example, you see this sort of effects where they have more range of motion and different sort of anatomical positions, like different resting positions than normal people. Okay, let's start with a pretty simple movement like protraction, which is just the shoulder blade coming forward. One thing that I was really intrigued to learn is that protraction involves a slight internal rotation. And the reason for this is that you want to keep the scapula as close to the thorax, so the rib cage, as possible during basically every movement to ensure stability. Now, the reason that I say that this is quite surprising is that, frankly, like internal rotation is rather vilified, and even though it seems like it is an important movement, it's always external rotation that gets the limelight, and internal rotation is sort of exactly vilified, looked on poorly. So it's interesting to see that it's actually integral to certain movements. And there's actually a bunch of movements like this. So for example, during elevation of the scapula, so like a shrug, there is a sort of forced anterior tilt. It's only slight, but again, anterior tilt is something that's vilified. People are always promoting posterior tilt, but there's certain movements where we need those opposing vilified actions to occur. The last movement I want to discuss something like this is extension of the shoulder. So that's when the arm sort of comes behind the body. So actively we can get about 60 degrees and passively about 85 degrees. But what happens at end range is again some sort of anterior tilt because we're stretching the capsule of the shoulder. Speaking of the capsule, so this is a very interesting and intricate structure where we have all of these sort of insertion points of muscles and other ligamentous structures that wrap the joint and stabilize it. Now it actually has a bit of laxity. It's kind of a loose structure. But once we tension it by sort of tensing other muscles, pushing things to end range, twisting, it sort of develops some stability. But we can actually develop like a chronic tightness in the capsule. This is why things like banded capsule immobilizations are really effective because they address like a different type of structure that's not often addressed with things like stretching. Something that I thought was just fascinating is that if we have a tight anterior capsule, we'll be limited in our external rotation capability because basically that tightness is going to push the humerus backwards. And conversely, if you have a tight posterior capsule, you're going to push the humerus forward, so you're going to be limited in internal rotation. So essentially it doesn't matter how much internal rotation or external rotation work you're doing, how much mobility work you're doing, if you're skipping the capsular work, you're always going to run into these limitations if it is already tight. And speaking of having tight or compensated issues, if we look again at the protraction movement, something that's really fascinating is that during protraction, you're moving at the sternoclavicular and acromioclavicular joints, so where the sternum meets the clavicle and where the clavicle meets the shoulder blade. And basically, if you get a restriction in either one of those joints, so say a reduction in the range of motion at like the sternoclavicular joint, you'll apparently see an increase in range of motion at the acromioclavicular. So there's this balance and compensation that takes place. So I think that would be very sort of useful for a diagnostic perspective. Staying on this theme of improper motion, we can look at downward rotation. Downward rotation is another classically vilified issue of movement, and the reason for this is that if you have chronic downward rotation, you have scapular winging, which is really bad. It's an incorrect movement of the scapula, and it almost looks like the scapula comes off and wings off of the ribcage, which, if you think back to what I said earlier, really bad because we want it to hug the ribcage for stability. Now apparently that chronic downward upward rotation is sometimes associated with a weak or paralyzed upper trap. So again, maybe all of the serratus anterior work, which is something that does upward rotation and is often what is promoted as a way to deal with scapular winging, if that's not working, like it hasn't been in someone like myself, perhaps the answer is like actually addressing the upper trap or the nerve that innervates the upper trap, which is sort of in the neck. But if we look at downward rotation as a whole, it's not evil, it has to occur. So for example, if the arm's overhead, it has to be upwardly rotated, but as we come back down, it needs to downwardly rotate. Now it does stop when the arms reach the side, or it should, and it's essentially the anatomical neutral position. It's when it gets past that we seem to have some sort of issues, but again, it's not an evil movement per se, it just depends on the context of what we're doing. And lastly, I just want to touch on abduction and flexion. So these are actually often described in a similar way. So abduction is really just like lifting out to the side, and flexion is lifting up to the front. But ultimately, you can describe it as abduction for both of them, just depending on what plane we're referring to being in. So is it the sagittal plane or in the frontal plane? It doesn't matter. The idea is that we get pretty similar requirements for movement, regardless of whether or not it's flexion or abduction. So one key example of this is that during abduction or flexion, we get approximately a 2-to-1 ratio of glenohumeral abduction, so the actual shoulder joint, the ball and socket, compared to the upward rotation of the scapula. So we should get double abduction as we do compared to upward rotation, and it should occur simultaneously. And that point I think is really important. Someone like myself will often cue it and really try and drive, say, posterior tilt, external rotation, upward rotation, but you're trying to do that off the rip, you're trying to do everything all at once, but really this needs to be a rhythm. It needs to occur simultaneously in harmony. Now there is some variation in the ratio, but it's generally close to 2-to-1. Now, speaking of that harmony, there are a bunch of other things that should be occurring when we're doing abduction or flexion. One is that the sternoclavicular joint should be elevating and retracting. The scapula, again, progressively posteriorly tilting, and at end range it should essentially be externally rotating somewhat, and the clavicle should be rotating posteriorly along its own axis. And lastly, the glenohumeral joint should be getting a fair bit of external rotation, and most of this should occur before about 60 to 70 degrees of abduction. However, if we're looking at flexion, it's going to need more external rotation to occur. Now I hope that is helpful. This is information that, like I said, I've really struggled to find online, so I think that this could be very helpful for someone to apply to their own training, and I hope it is for you. For those of you who don't know, this is all a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge that I've been learning this, where I've been reading 50 pages of a physio or exercise book and doing 50 minutes of exercise in a day in an attempt to rehab myself. And all of what I just discussed has come from Newman's kinesiology. Looking at the exercise portion of things, previously I've been doing some internal rotation, isometrics, and very slight movement work, and it was very effective at sort of generating some internal rotation. I did attempt to drop some of the initial isometrics and jump straight into the movements, and it seems that they were necessary, so I'm going to try and implement them back in. With my wrist, I've been doing a bunch of capsular work and some joint rotations and then loading it as well. I did try and drop the posterior pull on the capsular mobilization, and it didn't seem to have an effect. So the reason I'm trying to drop some of these things is I sort of throw everything at the wall to start, and then I'm trying to retract and see what was actually necessary. It's not exactly a great scientific process, but you know, it would be better to start with, do one at a time for 6 weeks and see what works. But, I'm in pain, so I'm going to do what I can do. And yeah, that is about it for day 42. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.